Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on that I feel needs a bit of an introduction. You see, the gameplay footage in the background is of the original Halo, specifically the PC version, which was ported over to PC by Gearbox Software a couple of years after the original Xbox version came out. Now, of course, these days it's a bit of a process getting it up and running properly on a modern system because it was not designed to run in modern resolutions, and so after installing and patching the game, you have to also install a compatibility mod like Chimera. So I went through all that process. It took me something like 40 minutes, I think, altogether, because I kept running into weird issues here and there. And I set about doing some recording tests, because I'm planning on doing a redux of the original Halo at some point. I have no idea when that's going to be. But suffice to say, I wanted to make sure the game was up and running and that I can reliably record it. And I did something completely subconsciously. I set the game to the Legendary difficulty. And here's the thing. I remember playing through the Legendary difficulty back in the day. The thing is, that was a long time ago. The last time I played Halo 1 was right before I did my original review of it, and at this point, that was over a decade ago. And while between then and now, I've certainly played through the rest of the Halo games except for Halo 5 and of course the two Halo Wars games, I've not really messed around much with the Legendary difficulty in the rest of the Halo series. I completed the original one on Legendary, but I never really did that with the later games. I might have messed around with it for a bit, but I always played through them on either normal or heroic. So on the surface, there's not really much reason for me to have selected the Legendary difficulty on the original Halo when I went in to do some recording tests. But I did that subconsciously, and I only realized my horrible mistake in that regard once I got to about the midpoint of the first level, and then I decided to stick with it for a bit so I could get some more recording tests in, and the end result is, well, the gameplay footage that you've been seeing in the background this entire time. The good news about it is that the recording works, so I will be able to do that redux eventually, and that I'm not far enough into the game where I end up with a sunk cost fallacy problem, and I can just restart the game in its entirety on a more reasonable difficulty like, say, normal or heroic. And that ultimately brings me to the subject of this particular My Thoughts On video, because it got me thinking about why I selected that Legendary difficulty setting, why it was just reflex to do it. And while some of it is that I generally opt for the higher difficulty settings in first-person shooters, with Halo specifically, it was the subconscious memory of Halo fans shrieking that you have to play through the game on the Legendary difficulty setting before you know what you're talking about. And that's when I realized that I was doing it as something of a subconscious defensive measure, because you will see this kind of thing all the time. In a vain attempt to discredit any and all criticism of a game they absolutely adore, fanboys will resort to just latching onto anything they can. And one of the big things they'll try to latch onto is the difficulty setting. They'll say that because you didn't play through the game on the hardest difficulty setting, you just don't know what you're talking about. Because you're, I don't know, I guess not skilled enough at the game to be able to complete it on the highest difficulty setting. As if that somehow makes a difference on your ability to critically assess the game. I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand some of that sentiment. Namely the idea that there are a lot of games journalists, in massive air quotes there, who clearly should not be doing any sort of review content at all. Because they either clearly have no interest in video games at all, or they're not interested in the specific genre or the series or whatever that they're covering, or they're just so astoundingly incompetent at playing the game that they, for example, can't even finish the tutorial, or they even have difficulty playing the game on the easy setting. But there is a difference between reasonable expectations and unreasonable demands. So a reasonable expectation, for example, would be that someone seeking to review a game would at the very least be able to play through the entire thing on the standard difficulty setting. Why? Because the standard difficulty setting is the baseline. That is the difficulty setting that the general audience that game is targeted towards is meant to play the game at. Any difficulty setting higher than the standard is optional for people who want the additional challenge, and any difficulty setting lower than that is meant for people who are just starting out and who are trying to learn the game's mechanics or trying to learn the mechanics of the entire genre, or for people who either aren't up to the task of playing through the game on standard difficulty or higher, or just don't want to. To tie this back in with what I do, normally I play first-person shooters, for example, on the hard difficulty setting, because I usually find the normal difficulty and lower to be too easy. There are some exceptions to this, however. For example, when I play first-person shooters on console, normally I set it to the normal setting instead of the hard setting. And that is precisely because I absolutely hate playing first-person shooters, and third-person shooters for that matter, with a gamepad. I am considerably more comfortable and much more precise with a keyboard and mouse. Which is why I generally don't review a lot of console-exclusive first-person shooters on my channel, and when I do review them, the gameplay often looks like somebody who barely has an idea of what they're doing is playing the game. If I had the option of playing that game on a keyboard and mouse instead of playing it with a gamepad, you would notice that the gameplay would be considerably smoother and much more precise. But here's the thing, I have a lot of experience playing first-person shooters. I have been playing them since the early 90s, so that's going on 30 years at this point. And while my reflexes and especially eyesight aren't what they used to be, I am still more than capable of playing through just about any first-person shooter out there, and I'm capable of playing through them on hard difficulty settings. You may think to yourself, oh, DW is gloating here, but no, I actually have a point to make with this. I understand what my capabilities are as well as what my limitations are, and I work within those. Most people would consider that more than reasonable for me being able to review first-person shooters. I very clearly enjoy the genre, I clearly play a lot of them, and I play them at a reasonably high skill level. And while I am certainly not on the same skill level as, say, a pro Quake player, what I am capable of achieving is more than sufficient for reviewing the game for a general audience. Which is what I do. Contrary to what some people out there think, a review does not exist to validate your existing opinion. A review does not exist to stroke the egos of the game's developers or the game's existing fans. A review is a critical assessment of a product, in this particular case, video games. And while there is certainly a subjective element to that, and especially in video games' case there are quite a few subjective elements to it, you're still ultimately critically assessing a product, determining what the quality level of that product is, and then based on your assessment, making recommendations to your audience as to whether or not they consider purchasing it. Now, of course, because there are subjective elements to this whole process, these sorts of things will invite discussion, and there is nothing wrong with that. But where things will quickly go wrong is when the fans of those games start rolling in and will effectively make it their life's mission to find every single thing they can complain about in a given review and effectively try to bully the reviewer into submission by just constantly pestering them about it. Because for these people, reviewing games is not about making critical assessments of a product and then, based on those assessments, making recommendations to an audience. No, for these people, these games have become effectively a pillar of their personalities. And thus, they will take any and all criticism of those games as personal affronts. They see themselves as defending the honor of their beloved game, defending it from the interference of the outsiders, defending it from being dumbed down to the lowest common denominator. And so they will start listing their demands for how you must play this game this one specific way, on this one specific difficulty setting. Otherwise, you have no idea what you're talking about, and everything you say about that particular game is wrong. And the tone of that sort of thing can vary wildly. You can have the people who are acting like they're being helpful, where they're saying, oh, you just don't understand the game. Here, have a bunch of tutorials and guides and such that you must study religiously in order to understand this game and understand what a masterpiece it is before you review it. And then at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the people who will throw all pretense out the window and will just proceed to hurl all manner of vileness and insults at you. And because of all of this, you might be tempted to acquiesce to some of those demands, like playing the game on the hardest difficulty setting and playing through it multiple times, Not really because you're into it, but because you feel like you're obligated to. But here's the simple reality of the matter. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many times you replay a game, no matter what difficulty settings you play it on, no matter how much of a completionist run you do, and no matter how good at that game you are, you will always receive backlash for criticizing it. Because these people are not interested in a critical assessment of that game. The only thing they are interested in with regards to a review of that game is whether or not that review showers that game in adoration. If that review is positive, you will see a comment section full of, "I agree with this, and what a great review!" And if that review is negative or even middle of the road, well, they'll just tear through the entire video and look for anything at all they can latch onto and either mock the reviewer for, or act like they're tearing apart their arguments with. And it doesn't matter either how the reviewer responds to those comments, because the goalpost will always keep moving. If you play through a game on the normal difficulty setting, they'll say you need to play it on the hardest setting. If you play through it on the hardest setting, they'll say you need to play through the game multiple times and get all of the secrets and so on and so forth. If you manage to do that, if you do a 100% completionist playthrough on the hardest difficulty setting, and you are still criticizing the game, then they will still say you are playing it wrong. They might bring up speedrunners or pro players or whatever as the prime examples of who is eligible. But even if you play it on that level, so long as you are not showering the game in excessive praise, they will still not accept your criticism. They will always find something to latch onto and attack, whether it be your personality, or something you say, or some argument you make. It does not matter what it is, they will latch onto it, and they will try to use it as a bludgeon with which to beat you into submission so that you convert over to their ways. And the only thing you are ever going to accomplish by appeasing them, by acquiescing to their demands, is making things harder for yourself with absolutely no benefit. But because for certain games those sorts of comments are so pervasive, it can get into the reviewer's head. And sometimes a reviewer just needs to remind themselves that they're not making reviews for the people who are already fans of the game in question. Thanks for watching. And if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.